Hello and welcome to this edition of Bakul Talks. Well, I'm sitting at the Bakul Library in Bhubaneswar, and this is one of our outreach activities. Well, in the pandemic, when the library closed, we started online engagements, and for a long time, we had wanted to start a series of public lectures on topics of common interest. Nowadays our learning is so much in silos that if I'm a student of literature, I don't try to know anything about the sciences, and vice versa. So we thought, can there be lectures on topics of common interest, irrespective of one's disciplinary background, and of course talks by experts, but in a language that is intelligible and interesting to teenagers. So that is our focus. That it should not only be esoteric to only intellectuals, but at the same time, even if it is interesting and intelligible to teenagers, what we aim at is that it should be insightful to intellectuals as well. But so topics of common interest for any curious individual, whatever be your intellectual background, whatever you might be studying, or as a student, or we always study, of course. So that is the idea behind Bakul Talks, and we thought, why not we begin with a series on the Nobel Prizes of 2020. We all know that they're very significant work with great impact on mankind, but we are often in an inertia. We would probably want to know, but we never really make the effort to try to know what is it about. And we have had the best of experts speaking. We've already covered the Nobel Prize in Peace, Physics, Chemistry, and Economics, and we have medicine the next Tuesday. So Bakul Talks is happening every Tuesday at 7 p.m. on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, live at 7 p.m. Now, this, of course, is happening, as I told you. In addition to this, we also have the other online engagements, like every Saturday at 9 p.m. We have story time at 9, in which we travel to different countries with one of the finest storytellers from that country, who also introduces the culture of the country. So that's multicultural exposure that's happening. And this Saturday, we are traveling to Canada. Last Saturday, we were in another country. Okay, we were in Indonesia before that. So that's how it's been going. Every Sunday, we have Robibar Gopabar, which is storytelling in Odia, right? So, but in addition to this, we are also having a program this Thursday, which is kind of out of the regular programming, which is a book launch. We can just have the poster now. Mrs. Shubha Sharma, who is with the government in Orissa, who happens to head the Department of Textiles, Handlooms, and Handicrafts, has written her second work of fiction, her novel, The Avasthis of Amnagari. So that is being launched live again on the Bakul handles on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter this time, right at 8. So we are starting a author interaction series, which we are calling it as Right at 8. So this will be on Thursday. But now back to today's talk. So today we are talking about the Nobel Prize in Literature, and we have one of the, which was awarded to Louise Glick, a very famous poet. We have a copy of a book, Averno, at the library, which when the library reopens, hopefully in a month's time, with incidences of COVID reducing, you can come and check it out. In fact, at the library, when we set up this library, we said our job is not to be like a regular library. Our job is to get people to read. And so we actually created a separate bookshelf of the Nobel laureates. So, thinking that potential readers might be drawn to these books, knowing that, they have been written by Nobel laureates out of curiosity. So that is there. So you can see, I'll talk more about that later. But today we are very fortunate and very happy that we have with us Ranjit Hoskote, who is one of the finest contemporary poets in India, whose poetry I love. Hopefully we'll get to hear him read out some of his poems also. But along with, his eminence as a poet, he's, like I was a student of literature. When I studied my master's, of course, we read Jayanta Mahapatra, Nissim Ezekiel, Dom Moraes. Now, if you talk about the stalwarts in the contemporary Indian English poetry scene today, Ranjit Hoskote will be right there. You cannot miss him. But not only that, what is also very dear to us is that he is one of the very eminent, art historians and art critics in India. Now, when we started, and a lot of people were surprised with our engagement with books on the one hand and arts on the other hand. But here is one person who has done it very well, and he has a whole, wonderful over of work, which we'll get to. I hope that we will have another interaction with him on a Bakul platform later, where we talk about his work. But today we have Ranjit talking about Louise Glick, and you can ask him questions after he finishes discussing the Nobel Prize in Literature and the poetry of Louise Glick. Over to you, Ranjit.
Sujit, thank you so much for your very warm and generous words of welcome. And I'd also like to greet everyone who's joining us online for this program. And it's really a privilege to be speaking here on the platform of Bakul Talks, because your vision is one that I cherish greatly. The idea that one must not make a distinction between the so-called hard sciences and the soft sciences, or the sciences and the humanities. The fact is that all these fields of knowledge are closely allied. And if you have one without the other, you really will face certain deficits as a human being, as a citizen, as someone who knows how to address and engage with the world. So to me, it's very, very important that we keep in mind at all times the bridge that connects the sciences and the humanities, and in fact, all disciplines with one another. Also, I wish we were actually doing this physically in Bhubaneswar. I've only had the privilege of being in your beautiful city once, and that was for just about 2 days. So I ended up going to Dhauli and Udaygiri and Hirapur, where I, of course, wanted to go, and would really like to spend more time there. And I hope we'll have that opportunity at some point. And also, I was very intrigued by your very gracious invitation to speak on Louise Glick's work. Her surname was, the family originally came from Central Europe. So in German, one would say Gluck, but as the Americans tend to transform all these names on impact, she herself pronounces the surname as Glick. So I'll stay with that when I speak of her. The reason I warmed to your format of speaking about the Nobel Prizes is because the Nobel Prizes really do set up a certain standard, if you will, of global excellence in each of these disciplines. Which is not to say that the prizes have always been uniformly accurate, so to speak. It's not as if they've always gone to the right people. It's not as if the right people have always been recognized by these prizes. So even as we celebrate prizes such as the Nobel, we should remain aware that all such recognitions of achievement are part of larger political, cultural, economic, and other contexts. For instance, a scientist called Alexis Carrel did in fact get the Nobel Prize for medicine. But we now know that he was a practitioner and a proponent of eugenics, and his thought flowed very strongly and sadly into Nazi and fascist thought. We know that somebody like Subramaniam Chandrasekhar, who made seminal foundational contributions to astrophysics, got the Nobel decades after a number of his students and grand students had won the prize. So there are these lags, there are these deficits. In my own field, in literature, you could argue that especially in the early decades of the prize, it went to authors who were well known within Europe. It went to authors who were citizens of the great powers. It did not necessarily go to practitioners elsewhere, practitioners in the global south. And one has to keep this in mind. At the same time, when I think about my own journey as a reader, I cherish the fact that so many of my favorite writers happen to have been winners of the prize. Either they'd already won it by the time I got to reading them, or they won the prize at some point after I'd made their acquaintance. I'm thinking here of Elias Canetti, for instance, of Ottavio Paz, of Joseph Brodsky, of Derek Walcott, of Seamus Heaney, of Czesław Miłosz. There are a great many poets, novelists, theater makers, and other contributors to literature who've been acknowledged through this prize. Then there is the contentious question of patronage, which, as you all know, has been discussed during the last few days. There are people who will ask questions about patronage. They will ask, why is it that the wealthy, the powerful, the great and the glorious, those who've made their money in questionable trades and occupations, why is it that they support culture? And I'm sometimes struck by the seeming innocence of these questions. We know from the dawn of history that patronage for culture is only possible when you have economic surpluses, which go beyond subsistence and that can then be placed at the service of larger questions and themes that pertain to the human adventure. Without patronage, we wouldn't have had the Kailashnath temple, we wouldn't have had the stupas, we wouldn't have had Ellora or Ajanta, we wouldn't have had the Taj Mahal, we wouldn't have had the Sistine Chapel. Look closely at the roots of all patronage, and you will find that it goes back to economic surpluses, and economic surpluses are not produced by saints. So let us accept, as Walter Benjamin pointed out, that the forces of civilization and the forces of savagery are very close to one another. This is part of the human adventure. This is part of the great totality in which we are invited to participate and to take our ethical stand as we will. But to imagine that culture is somehow unconnected to these larger social, political, and economic questions is just to be naive. That said, I would not wish to dispense with everything that prizes like the Nobel or literature festivals or publishing or the art world. These circuits offer something to us which extends our imagination. It expands our consciousness. It, in fact, enables us and equips us to ask these very important ethical and political questions. And with these remarks, and I'm happy to discuss these later if anyone would like to do so, I'm going to now devote myself to the poet whose work I wish to celebrate today, Louise Glick. And I'll begin by going back to the time when I heard her read. In 1995, I was a writer in residence at the University of Iowa as part of its creative writing wing. And as part of the life of this university in the Midwest of the USA, practically every evening there was someone who was visiting, a poet, a nonfiction writer, a novelist, a theater person, someone who wrote for cinema. There was a constant movable feast of writers who were coming in, reading from their work, meeting those of us who were writers in residence, addressing public gatherings. And one of these was Louise Glick. And I had that electric experience of hearing her 25 years ago, literally this month, at the University of Iowa's Shamble Auditorium. And honestly, I recall her voice as if I heard it yesterday. It dwelt on the moments of exhilaration and self-doubt that recur in the work she was writing at the time. It had gone into her 1992 collection, The Wild Iris, which really has lavish evocations of the natural world. It dwells also on the hesitancies of the human individual at large in that world, shuttling between intimacy and grandeur of scale. And I think of these lines from a poem called Lullaby, which occurs in that book, The Wild Iris. And I quote, "Listen to my breathing, your own breathing, like the fireflies, each small breath a flare in which the world appears." End of quote. And this relates for me with a conversation that I just had with a dear friend, the artist Jitish Khaled, earlier today. Jitish has been working on a very tightly focused set of drawings of leaves and of the stems of plants. And as he draws the stem, he thinks to himself of how he's drawing the body of a plant, but also of the shadow, and how this plant tracks the entire span of time from sunrise to sunset. So as he was explaining it to me, when he draws the plant, he's also drawing the movement of the sun through the sky. So a very small thing like a little plant reflects and holds the entirety of the cosmic day. And this is the kind of dialogue between intimacy and grandeur of scale that you find in so many of Louise Glick's poems. There is also in Glick's poetry a deep concern with the archetypal, with the great myths of quest, of loss, of journeying that sustain all of us in the deep levels of our cultural consciousness, no matter where we might come from. So I recall her voice also as it invoked the figures of Orpheus and Eurydice from Greek mythology. Orpheus, the great musician and hero, Eurydice, his wife, who dies early, and he goes down into hell, into Hades, to seek her. And he brings her back to the light of day, but makes the mistake of looking back to see if she's still there. And that's the condition that's placed on her return, that if he ever looks back, he will lose her. So it's this incredible tragedy of looking back, holding, losing, that she invokes in these poems, the life-changing descent into dark valleys. And as she read, she also shared work that had not yet been published. And I'm thinking here of lines from another of her poems called Lute Song, where she thinks about the relationship between life and death, vitality and mortality, art and absence. And I'm going to quote a few lines from this poem, Lute Song. I made a harp of disaster to perpetuate the beauty of my last love, yet my anguish, such as it is, remains the struggle for form. End of quote. And in this, she encapsulates so much that we know to be at the heart of the artistic enterprise, whether you're a poet, a novelist, a painter, a filmmaker, or a musician. You are dealing with the raw materiality of emotion. You're dealing with affect. You're dealing with all the anxieties, the troubles, the turbulence, the disturbances of being human among other human beings. And yet you want to create something that technically might survive forever, something that is formally well-structured, that has elegance. Poets, just like mathematicians, speak of elegance. What is the most elegant solution in a line? What is the pattern, the measure, the beat, the cadence that holds a line in your ear, your mind, and in your memory? So when Louise Glick writes, I made a harp of disaster, it really is talking about how, whilst you're falling to pieces as a human being, you're taking your dilemmas, your indecisions, your sufferings, and you're making them into something that is whole, that is measured, that is art. And I'll pull back a little to the poet that I used to be when I was in my 20s. And when I was in my 20s, the four poets to whose work I found myself most drawn, and which I found profoundly important, they were all American women poets. And I know this might sound strange, because you'll ask yourself, I lived in Bombay when I was in my 20s. I mean, I came and went, I also lived elsewhere. But you might ask yourselves, why should an Indian poet be so drawn to four American poets who had begun to publish in the 1950s and the 1960s? And I'd like to engage with that question. Because very often we are told by well-meaning people, write what you know about, they say. And at one level, that might make sense. There's a certain realism to that. I mean, why would one write about things that one knew nothing about? That might just end up as empty fantasy. But there's another way of looking at this question. If one only wrote about what one knew about, what happens to curiosity? What happens to your engagement with people, places, predicaments that you want to know about? And you write your way towards knowing this. So, and finally, how well do we know what we know? How well do we know ourselves? There's so many people who have discovered what they might really be like in these months of solitude and lockdown and pandemic. We often internalize a normal, standard sense of who we are. But in times of turmoil, that might break down. We might discover that we're actually quite different people. What our intuition tells us and what our reason tells us are two different things. How well do we know our family? How well do we know our friends? What happens to these close relationships under stress, under pressure? Do we always know that? So to imagine that one can write from a sovereign position of knowing is actually a bit silly. The whole point about literature is that it is a bridge. It allows one to speak from a place of curiosity, from a place of love, from a place of attentiveness to the other. And that, to me, is when literature really comes to life. So that's my brief answer to why it's why the poetry of these 4 American women poets really appealed to me so much when I was in my 20s. What attracted me to their work was precisely that struggle for form that Glick talks about in this poem that I just quoted. And in their work, I found that there was a certain relationship between the personal, often disorienting experiences that they had gone through, and on the other hand, their poetic utterance, the way in which it gave coherence to their human experience. And as I like to call it, the vicissitudes of the human adventure that they had gone on, that found impeccable form in their work as poets who were also expanding the lyric. They took the personal lyric, they took the I of that personal lyric, and they expanded it to embrace all the questions that they had dealt with as people who worked between cultures, as people who had been involved with the civil rights movement, as people who had questioned the patriarchy, who had questioned race. They had questioned authority in its various forms, whether it was questions of gender, sexual preference, race, social location. And so the poetry that these 4 women, Adrienne Rich, Sharon Olds, Jory Graham, and Louise Glick, produced in very different and distinctive ways, was a poetry that celebrated but also questioned. It reached out with empathy, but it also reached out to the world with a certain criticality. And this made great sense to me, even if I didn't share their location, didn't share their gender, didn't share their particular social or political ethos. They each offered vivid examples of poetic practice. They showed how a poet's work can be experimental, how it can disrupt and remake itself, how it can expand its emotional potential beyond a narrow confessional I, and how it can reach out to different horizons of culture and of meaning, and how it can explore new psychic and social contents. So this is why, long distance as it might be, these 4 poets were so important to me, alongside a number of other poets. Remember that I'm assuming that many of you here are readers, young writers, young poets. The best thing that you can do is to apprentice yourself very, very widely and very, very deeply. And do not be insecure about losing your voice. You know, your voice is not something that's lost out there in the shrubbery and that you have to go looking for it. Your voice is something that you craft out of the plurality that you make your own. So I'll now say a few things in biographical terms about Louise Glick, so you have a clearer sense of what ethos she emerges from. She was born in New York City in 1943, at a time when World War II was raging on, and the US had mobilized itself on multiple fronts, active in Europe against the Nazis, active also in the Pacific against Japan. So it was a country humongously at war and going through a number of social and political changes that would play out over the next 20 years. So she actually grew up in that era of dramatic changes. You see, World War II had translated as a space of freedom for a lot of people. Women had gone to work in heavy industry because the men were away at war. They developed a sense of their own autonomy, and they were not going to give up those privileges at the end of the war. So that flowed into the movement for civil rights. African Americans had fought in the war. They had held weapons, they had fought for their country, they had asserted their agency, and they had played a major role in the making of history. They were not going to come back and settle for being second or third class citizens. They discovered a great agency and autonomy, and that also played into the great movement for civil rights that raged into the 60s and which resulted in a tremendous shift in racist attitudes. That is yet a work in progress, as we see from what's happening. It's also through the 50s and the 60s that people of immigrant background really became part of this larger American story. Remember that Louise Glick's family had moved from Europe. They were Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe who had moved from a very anti-Semitic Europe to America, which they saw as a space of new possibilities. And speaking of the connection between the sciences and the arts that Sujit was talking about, I find it interesting that Louise Glick's father and uncle actually were involved in engineering. Among other products that they manufactured, They invented the high-precision X-Acto knife. Many of you will know it if you're architects or designers or at all are working with paper cutting in any way. And many critics have thought that this was a significant metaphor for Glick's poetry. She takes a resolute and sometimes relentless X-Acto knife to the complexities of the emotions, of emotional life. In a stoic elegy for Dido, who was abandoned by her lover, Aeneas, the Trojan hero, in her poem The Queen of Carthage, Glick writes, and I quote, "Brutal to love, more brutal to die, and brutal beyond the reaches of justice, to die of love." At the core of Louise Glick's poetry are the claims of desire and trauma, the processes of ordeal and healing, the imminent loss and the redemptive transfiguration of the self. Revisiting the seams of childhood and the simultaneously nurturing and constraining framework of the family, her poetry activates memories of love and sex. It confronts the bleak reality of death. It places the drama of human life against the cycle of the seasons and of plant life. So always in her poetry, Glick drafts and refashions an individual self that balances between passion and regret. And you see this across the arc of her published work, from her very first book, Firstborn in 1968, to the most recent one, Faithful and Virtuous Night, which came out in 2014. She tries to stabilize, or at least to bear witness, to the shifting relationship between the intelligence and the senses. So on the one side, you have the intelligence, which is weighted over on the side of reflection and order, and on the other hand are the sensuous appetites. They're marked by a headlong, instinctual, self-annihilating revelry of pleasure and pain. And through this balance of passion and regret, she often speaks in the voice of advice. So in this poem called The Sensual World, she cautions the person she's speaking to, who could well be a younger self, her own younger self. And I quote, "Your body will age, you will continue to need, you will want the earth, then more of the earth. Sublime, indifferent, it is present, it will not respond. It is encompassing, it will not minister. Meaning, it will feed you, it will ravish you, it will not keep you alive." End of quote. Again, a little earlier, I spoke of how in Glick's poetry, there is this constant play of scale between the intimacy of the individual human being and the grandeur of the seasonal and the natural cycles. Now, once again, what this poem says to us is, remember that your body will decay. You are mortal, but your planet isn't. Life goes on, time goes on. How do you cope with the fact that you will someday face extinction? And at the same time, her poetry is increasingly aware that thanks to the way humankind has treated this planet, the planet is also vulnerable now to extinction. How do we deal with these questions of mortality? How do we deal with these questions of what it means to come to an ending? And these questions would be intolerable if we did not have the resources of story, of myth, of legend, of fable to nourish and to sustain us. Sujit was speaking earlier of how Bakul talks focuses on storytelling. The reason we tell ourselves these stories is to remind ourselves that in generation after generation, irrespective of time and place, human beings have faced these questions, these crises, these dilemmas, and we should take some consolation, some solace from seeing how other people have dealt with these problems, with these anxieties. They're not uniquely our own. And Louise Glick has that same attitude. Her poetry, as I've written elsewhere, is the ampersand. It's the hyphen between memoir and myth, between dream and archetype, between the self that negotiates traffic in the street and the self that makes that journey into the underworld in quest of illumination. Glick is also an essayist. She's written remarkably beautiful personal essays on questions that haunt her as a writer, as a person. So in a 1999 essay called The Culture of Healing, she writes, and I quote, The poem is a revenge on loss, which has been forced to yield to a new form, a thing that hadn't existed in the world before. The loss itself becomes then both addition and subtraction. Without it, there would not have been this poem, this novel, this work in stone. End of quote. So I love the way in which she speaks of how the work of art somehow proceeds from a wound, from a sense of being separate from the world. You know, quite often we're told that it's a bad thing to be alienated. And I agree. Sometimes alienation from the people around you, from your situation, from the historical moment can be debilitating. You can feel that you've been left out of things, that you've been left behind. But alienation can also be an immensely enabling space. It's alienation that allows people to stand apart from a cruel economic system and to criticize it. It's when you're alienated from the world of profit and of comfort that you see how your planet is being stripped and exploited. You can see how your people are being rendered vulnerable. You need to be alienated from a system to be able to recognize this and to act on it. Similarly, in art, you need to be alienated from normalized and internalized understandings of how the world works to be able to create afresh, to gain some new vision, some new angle of vision on the world. And Glick, like many Americans of her generation, also went through psychoanalysis for a long time. And she regards that as a formative phase of individuation. And I would ask you to think about this. Maybe we can talk about it later. Is individuation also a process of alienation? To become an individual, do we not have to stand apart from the collective and everything it takes for granted? To be an individual, a thoughtful individual who can undertake transformative action, do you not have to stand apart from what everyone else is telling you is true and is fine? So I'd like us to think about how a poet like Louise Glick embarked on this process of individuation. And it's from this apprenticeship to exploratory narrative making, with all of its confusions and clarities, that she distills a strong awareness of our relationship to the key stories in our lives. In a 1990 essay, which is called Fear of Happiness, she identifies two features of these key stories that we all have. First, that they possess a durability, which distinguishes the archetypal from the anecdotal, as she says. And second, that such stories will offer a variety of possible centers of focus, because they, as she says, possess a certain interior spaciousness. I love this idea. And you know, a little while ago, I was talking about how these four American women poets that I admired actually blew open the space of the personal lyric. They acknowledged that they were, in fact, multitudes, that they could only be an individual by speaking for all those whose voices had been silenced, whose voices needed amplification. And I think that this is true when we think about the key stories of our lives. You know, what I'm saying to you is that you need to be individuated and to stand apart from what the collective is saying and doing and taking to be true. And at the same time, you can best be an individual also by connecting to those many, many people whose voices will never be heard, whose stories will never be told. And I think it's this seeming paradox. It's that paradoxical ground on which a lot of Louise Glick's poetry gets written. It's the ground on which a lot of great writing gets done, actually. And it's from this understanding of how spacious this opened up narrative can be that Louise Glick's favored strategy of translating and even transfiguring everyday experience into myth emerges. It's a strategy that people have criticized. Remember that when we celebrate a poet, it's not just idle praise. It's not only praise. We also have to take into account the kinds of things that a poet or a novelist may not be doing, and then ask ourselves, why? You know, in a context like the contemporary USA, contemporary North America, people tend to set great store by a certain particularity of identity as articulated through the optics of gender, of race, of ethnicity, of sexual orientation, or through claiming a particular immigrant legacy. Now, Glick's poetry does not do that. It's open enough to many of these situations, and she could have spoken from them. She chooses not to. And the distinguished literary critic Helen Wendler writes of this, and she says, and I quote Wendler here, she says, "The lean shape of myth is the nakedness guaranteeing all stories." And when you think about Louise Glick's poetry, you actually think about how there is, even if she doesn't necessarily use these particular optics, all of those sources of experience are present, or many of those sources of experience and suffering are present in her work. And yet she speaks to something that we could all regard as, if not universal, something that is the common inheritance of all humankind. And this brings me to two of my favorite lines in her poetry. It's from a poem called From the Japanese, which I will read out in full, and then I'll dwell on those lines. You know, sometimes when you're on speaking online, you wonder if there's anybody else out there, or if you're on a space station speaking to yourself. So some reassurance that there in fact are people listening would be hugely welcome at this point. But meanwhile, let me read the part of the poem that I really hold on to. It's a long poem. It's a long poem which I thought I might read in full, but maybe in the interests of time. Alone, watching the moon rise, tonight a full circle, like a woman's eye passing over abundance. This is the most it will ever be. Above the blank street, the imperfections solved by night. Like our hearts, darkness showed us their capacity. Our full hearts, at the time, they seemed so impressive. Cries, moans, our important suffering. A hand at the small of the back or on the breast. And now across the wall, someone is clearing the table, wrapping the dark bread and the white ceramic pot of butter. What did we think? What did we talk about? Upstairs, a light goes on. It must be Gwen's. It burns the span of a story. Why love what you will lose? There is nothing else to love. And that's what I'll quote from this poem. And those are the lines that I would dwell on. Why love what you will lose? There is nothing else to love. It's a recognition that all our human lives, our span on this planet itself is ultimately fated to being ephemeral, to being mortal. And yet it's within that ephemerality that we have to accomplish something and craft something into objects of significance, shapes even of life that are significant. And across her life, Louise Glick has won a great many awards. I'm not going to list them all. They include the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Guggenheim Fellowship for Creative Arts, the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, the Troma Prize. What is amazing is that despite this incredibly august track record of having her work recognized, her work has not settled into anything that is static. It is still, as it was at the beginning, deeply bearing witness to vulnerability. Through all this, Glick has retained a vulnerability, a lingering sense of being poised at the edge of failure, and she retains that need to secure herself against the world's onslaughts. And if anybody thought there was no politics in her work, I'm going to read to you now from an essay that actually addresses the deep heart of American politics. In the title essay of a book of essays called American Originality, Glick offers a striking critique of white America's self-image as a pioneer culture that's shaped itself in terra nullius, in empty land, inscribing its works on that emptiness. Emphasizing how such a laudatory account leaves out Native Americans and African Americans and their histories of oppression and suffering, Glick goes on to puncture its central assumption of bravado, its fundamental fiction of self-fashioning. And I quote, she writes, "Under the brazen, I made up a self of the American myth, the sinister sotto voce, I am a lie," end of quote. And then she goes on to say, and the liar wishes to elude judgment and censure, to avoid being caught. The literary art of our time mirrors the invented man's anxiety. It also affirms it. You are a fraud, it seems to say. You don't even know how to read. And for writers, this curious incomprehension, this being ahead of the time, seems superficially engaging. The fear of having taken the wrong path really haunts Glick's work. To every success she's that she's enjoyed, the acknowledgments that have come her way, there's also a sense that the writer is some way wearing a mask. I mean, in this time of pandemic, we're all wearing masks. But to her, it's a sense that, writers work through personae, they work through masks. What is the reality that they're really looking for? And that anxiety haunts her work. And I'm going to read from a poem called The Reproach, where she writes the following, and I quote, "All my life, I have worshipped the wrong gods. When I watch the trees on the other side, the arrow in my heart is like one of them, swaying and quivering." And I want us to hold on to this thought of how the truly major writer is one who never gets taken in by a sense of an achieved style, a normal way of doing things, success. None of this is truly integral to the practice of writing. When you go to your desk in the morning, whether you go to the morning or you spend your night writing, when you face that page, that screen, it's back to the beginning. You're asking yourself how all the skill, all the experience you've acquired can go into the making of a new form, as if you'd never written before. And how does it go into discovering past the masks, something that you really might be? I think that question will always be with every writer of any significance. And the sense of how one participates in a life larger than one's own, it comes through even in the most recent work. And I'm going to end by quoting a poem called A Village Life, where she writes in a spirit of retrospection, and I quote, "When I was a bird, I believed I would be a man. That's the flute, and the horn answers. When I was a man, I cried out to be a bird. Then the music vanishes, and the secret it confides in me vanishes also." End of quote. So in the wide panoramic span of Glick's poetry, which I have summarized truly cruelly in the span of less than half an hour, I want us to think about how it's a wager on the way in which the human imagination can extend itself to other human beings, to other predicaments, even to other species. In the poem that I just read, there is this question of how whatever situation you inhabit, you want to be somebody else. When you're a bird, you want to be a man. When you're a man, you want to be a bird. What is that music that unifies all of these separate desires? What is the music that brings us all together into this polyphony of being, which allows us to understand what it means to be the other? And this is the thought I want to conclude with. The thought that poetry, far from being divorced from our everyday turmoil, is actually deeply of that turmoil. It remains engaged with that turmoil. And it invites us into a space where we can best be ourselves by also wondering what it means to be others, what it means to be vulnerable as others are, to be voiceless as others are, and what it means to bear witness to that situation. So these are the thoughts that I want to leave you with. And I'm open to questions or observations if anyone has them now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ranjit. I wish you could have gone on and on and on. And those lines, for example, why love what you will lose when there's nothing else to love. I mean, not only that, I think what I loved about your talk was also you actually made me think a lot about many of our givens, like the point you made about alienation and the advantages of alienation. The point you made about, I never thought about it as a kind of arrogance, the whole attempt at knowing, something. So
thank you.
Very interesting points that you raised, and I'm sure many of our viewers, listeners here would be, engaging with those thoughts. I'll tell you something. In the other talks that we had, particularly the one on physics and chemistry.
Right.
And because you talked about, again, the connection between sciences and arts. So
Yes.
I often use this anecdote, which I'll repeat because I see there are some children from class 5 and 7 also in this school. Yeah.
Oh, my. Okay.
So there's a basic question. We'll come to that of what is a personal lyric, since you talked about that. So a couple of people have asked that. But before that, So an anecdote I often repeat is about another person. He talked about controversies, people who didn't get the Nobel. Einstein never got a Nobel for his famous theory of relativity, but we all know about the eminence of Einstein. Now, there's this famous story of a woman going to Einstein and asking him, I want my son to be a scientist. Please tell me what to do. And Einstein said, read him fairy tales. And the woman then said that, you're joking. I'm asking a very serious question. And Einstein said, but I'm giving you a very serious answer. And then later on, if I want him to be more intelligent, what do? Read him more fairy tales. So that's a story. Apparently, it is true. There are so many things that are attributed to Einstein,
indeed,
which are not. But this is something I checked, and it's so true about these connections. And I don't know how many of you know, Alfred Nobel himself at one point, I mean, he of course made lots of money from which he donated, and the Nobel Prizes were instituted with his endowment. But at one point in time, he actually wanted to be a poet. He thought he'll give up all this, and he was writing poetry, and he got appreciation from some people, and he had wanted to be that. But anyway, that's something we'll come back to later. I'll also tell you, Ranjit, very interesting. Last Thursday, we had a conversation with an author from Luxembourg on the Bakul platform. And she said that the government of Luxembourg thinks that as important as supporting health and education, it is to support cultural nourishment.
Absolutely.
You made that point about the importance of culture. So I thought it was so important and such a powerful statement.
I completely agree, because unfortunately, there's a kind of developmentalist thinking still present in India. It comes from our early years of independence, where, of course, it was vital to build up infrastructure. But this should never have been a binary, an either or. The fact is that culture is not some optional extra. To open up an inclusive and dialogic space of culture should be a matter of a civic right. So I would definitely agree. And for instance, look at how Germany has looked after its artists and writers through this period of pandemic and lockdown. They've all received support from federal funding. I mean, it's an acknowledgement of the fact that culture and cultural producers and practitioners are integral to society. They're not, people who are expendable.
Exactly. And in fact, people, we feel good about our storytelling and the other programs, because a lot of parents and children have said that thanks to, bring this kind of positivity and this kind of wonderful world of imagination at a time when, which is otherwise so depressing. And the good thing, I'll tell you, many children have actually written to us that now they've started reading more because of the storytelling sessions.
That's wonderful. That is truly wonderful to hear. Yeah.
So we'll talk more, but let's see. Maybe you can begin with this question that these young children, Rajeshwari and Ipsita, have asked about the personal lyric. Since you talked about the personal lyric, so maybe you can just begin with that.
Okay. It's a rather complex question, not as simple as it seems, because I summarized it sharply. But let me put it to you this way: there's a certain tradition, particularly within English poetry, of the short personal lyric. And it tends to be an expression of what you as a person are going through. And of course, at a certain level, that's perfectly legitimate. You have your own individual sense of suffering. You're putting it out there. You're sharing it. But a larger question, especially if you're a practicing poet, would be, why is your private suffering so vitally important in a world where thousands and millions of people are suffering? They're going through all kinds of questions. In what way can you reach out from your private sense of feeling bad, having been wronged. This is all extremely important to the individual. I'm not denying that in any way. But how do you make a bridge to larger predicaments, to larger questions? And I think that after a certain point, if you're not writing purely for yourself or a small circle, these questions become extremely important. And I think they're important both for aesthetic reasons and for ethical reasons. I mean, what does it mean to be a human subject in society, in the world today? And I say in the world today because the world is not an abstraction. We know that in this highly interconnected world, something that you do here could have consequences in Alaska. Some plastic that you would just throw out of your window here will ultimately land up in the Pacific. Something that you do here will affect the ice caps. Likewise, someone you've never seen and will never see in your life who lives on the other side of the world is doing something that will bring about a cyclone or a tsunami here. So we are in the midst of crises and situations that we are sharing with people we don't know, will never know, have never seen. But as ethical subjects, we need to be aware of that. So it's a question of scale. What is important to you? The fact that you're feeling bad, something's gone wrong with a friendship, something's gone wrong with an interpersonal relationship. That's terrible for you, for me, for any of us. We will suffer this privately. What is it that we impart to readers? Why should readers be expected to share in this and not in what they themselves have going on? So a brief answer is, how does the personal lyric then get beyond the narrowly personal? And how does it become a common ground for addressing larger questions of what many other people are going through? How does it become a ground of solidarity? How does it begin to speak for more voices than just your private voice? So that's one way in which I'd approach this question.
Okay, right. So there's Pranay who's asking, how vulnerable is it to be vulnerable? I don't know what exactly he means, but I'll tell you something, a question that I had once asked myself: how much suffering does a poet need?
My God. Ideally, suffering is not something you'd wish on anyone, but it is something that's part of the human
No, I'll tell you the context, like, like the movie where the poet stops writing poetry, because, and the question I had thought then was, any kind of creation is some kind of a self-destruction. I felt particularly if you're writing poetry out of suffering, and maybe at a point when the suffering becomes too much to handle, or I felt that maybe at sometimes you fall in love with your suffering if you are trying to get poetry out of it. I don't know. So maybe you can directly answer Pranay's question.
No, I think this would differ from one individual to another, one poet to another. But I would not romanticize conditions of suffering or vulnerability. The way in which I would parse this question of vulnerability here is really to ask ourselves, particularly if we've normalized ourselves into some condition of security, what does it mean to step outside of that? What does it mean to maybe give up a certain measure of privilege? And, sometimes we also lock ourselves in notions of literary privilege. We feel that, what is that beautiful line in the old Simon and Garfunkel song? I have my poetry to protect me, I think. It's a kind of, So my question then, I am a rock, that's the song. I don't know if anyone even remembers Simon and Garfunkel. That's another story. I'm showing my age. But, is your poetry going to protect you? Is it going to leave you open to new impulses? Or is it going to be a bridge? I think that poetry can do many things. So I don't know that there's a simple answer to this very important question: how vulnerable is it to be vulnerable? That's something we each have to find out for ourselves. And it isn't always at a dramatic level of emotional states and affect. It could also be quite practical. For instance, I am a multilingual person who writes for historical reasons in English. So I'm an Anglophone Indian poet. What might happen if I decided to write in another language? I translate from other languages. But supposing I sat down to actually write in Urdu, I have to start all over again. I'm exceedingly vulnerable. I know the language, I know its poetry, I know its traditions, but I translate from it. I don't write in it. I make myself vulnerable by starting all over again, by becoming an apprentice. When I'm a translator, I'm vulnerable because I'm opening myself up to, if I'm translating from Kashmiri to Lal Ded, the mystic, the 14th century woman mystic, I'm opening myself up to her and what she has to say. So vulnerability isn't always a dramatic emotional scenario. It's also about being willing to listen and learn, being willing to give up your hard-won ego. It takes a variety of forms. Vulnerability is a very complex and plural condition. So I'm just drawing out other literary situations which have equal import in this question of vulnerability.
Mitra is asking, what do you think about poems that are too direct but have punches, like Bukowski?
Yeah. Again, for me, I would see, I always have seen, in fact, poetry as a spectrum or a polyphony of very different kinds of styles, tonalities, approaches. So I might savor greatly a poet of very subtle tonalities like Khaled, but I might also respond to Bukowski, who, as you say, doesn't pull his punches. I might love the very elegant work of Jory Graham, but there's another poet whose work I would respond to equally, Sharon Olds, who's far more raw, far more direct. I don't see that one has to make a stylistic choice. You might prefer one kind of poetry over another, but I have absolutely no problem wandering between subtle, complex, elegant poetry and far more raw, direct poetry. These emphases might change with your mental state at some point, your age. I know that poetry that I loved when I was in my 20s, I don't necessarily return to now. And poetry that I hated then, I find deeply valuable now. Poetry changes on you. It's a strange and complex animal. And we, as human beings, are strange and complex animals. So we don't necessarily have a stable relation. Ask yourself, what did you read when you were 10, when you were 15, 20, now?
Since you mentioned Simon and Garfunkel, I would like to hear from you about what was your take on Bob Dylan and the very controversial.
I mean, I would say better Bob Dylan than Peter Handke. I mean, Peter Handke, although I loved his early work, I think many of us in my generation, of course, read his work for theater. But I mean, if you're going to give the Nobel Prize to somebody who denies genocide and supports mass murderers, I'm sorry, that one would draw the line there. That is deeply unfortunate. And no amount of literary merit would excuse that. About Bob Dylan, and I'm walking into a minefield here. I mean, he has many fans, millions of fans, and unfortunately, I'm not one of them. I don't really respond to his work at all. My feeling, actually, the year that prize was announced, was I felt, actually, if you really want to acknowledge the lyric impulse in popular music, then it should be Lenny Cohen. It should have been Leonard Cohen, who was both a poet and a songwriter. And that incredible link between poetry and song, which goes back to antiquity, was very, very powerful in his work. So purely personal response, I'm not sure everyone will agree with me, but this was my reaction. I wasn't against the idea that a songwriter should get the prize, but it was just my feeling that Lenny Cohen should have had it, because his work, his practice more correctly, more beautifully demonstrates this.
Talking about, you talked, of course, at the beginning, and it was a very important point you made about, the significance of the Nobel Prize, but at the same time, making us aware that it is not without its polemics and without its, problems. Sure. And, I sometimes feel that the Nobel Committee itself is caught between, in a bind between wanting to play to the gallery and being against playing to the gallery. Because I remember at a time when Salman Rushdie was a hot favorite to win the Nobel, and there have been others, and the argument that used to come is, I read somewhere that some Nobel Committee member had said that it would have been too predictable, too populist, too popular. At the same time, I was wondering, when Obama was given the Nobel Prize, and it all happened around the same time. When Malala was given, it's like the Sensex. You are investing in speculation that this is what they're going to achieve, and that is why you're going to give them. So sometimes I feel that. But I think, do you think, because my personal thought when the controversy happened, of course, I was not aware enough to make this comparison that this person deserved better than Bob Dylan. But I thought, because very often we have this discussion about what really is literature, and I often think that maybe the fact that in a way our understanding of literature comes from the written word, the letter, which very often we forget that this was radical in being given to someone whose the poetry was not meant to be read or written, but
Sure.
So you think that is also part of the controversy, that a songwriter, not someone who wrote for a reading audience, got the prize?
No, I agree with you. I think that is definitely true. That I think many of our stable notions of literature now are linked to print modernity, and we assume that it'll have to. Then you ask yourself whether he doesn't actually belong in some other domain, maybe entertainment. But I think that actually, Sujit, if I may just move this discussion in a slightly different direction, I think there are fundamental problems with the Nobel Prize for Literature, and they stem from the following. There are languages and literatures which never show up on the radar of the committee. And that has to do with, maybe it's because there isn't enough translation. Maybe it hasn't come to the august ears of the committee. For instance, I'm not just saying this because I have an audience here. I did genuinely believe that somebody like Girish Karnad, for his achievements as a writer in Kannada, in theater, deserved the Nobel Prize. I genuinely believe that Joy Goswami, the Bangla poet, deserves the Nobel Prize. But I also know that this is a highly unlikely scenario, because vast as the readerships for these languages are, they seem to just become oddly invisible. And this is tragic. So winning the Nobel Prize is no great guarantee that, I mean, as I said, there are very many very fine writers who've got the prize. But there are very many very fine writers who won't even get that prize because their languages are oddly under the radar. And that is the true tragedy of this prize. And honestly, I mean, it's not my locus to advise the committee in any way, but if they're serious about it, if this prize really has to, if it has to have significance, you need to go beyond the planet-wide languages. Yeah. And also, we're not speaking here of small languages that are about to become extinct. These are languages spoken by millions and read by millions of people.
Very rich literature, like you said, Bangla, Kannada.
Bangla, Kannada, Malayalam, Hindi, Urdu, any one of our languages. We're also trapped in this rather strange idea that these are regional languages. I don't even know what that means. Thanks to the diaspora, these languages are now spoken all over the world. They're read all over the world. A number of their practitioners do not live in India. Bangla, Urdu are not even spoken only in this one country. Bangla spills across the border one way, Urdu spills across another. Tamil has a huge diaspora, Gujarati does. I mean, many of our allegedly regional languages are actually global languages. So another corollary to what I'm saying here is that whilst we appreciate everything that happens in the lineage of the Nobel Prizes, we also need to look at people who've won the Sahitya Akademi Award, for instance, here. We have prizes closer home, which are also doing a great deal to recognize the rich diversity of our languages here and the marvelous work being done in our literatures.
Yeah, and I'm sure the listeners know that Ranjit also received the Sahitya Akademi Award way back in 2004. No, I mean, just
very kind.
That's a very important point you made. I had read about R.K. Narayan being nominated many times, and when in fact Graham Greene had taken it upon himself to get him the Nobel, the way Yeats had done for Tagore. But yeah, probably because R.K. Narayan was still writing in English. So many people writing in languages like Kannada or Bangla, which has very rich literature and many readers, would still probably not make it. And in fact, the Nobel Prize has also been accused of Eurocentrism. Right? I read somewhere that probably more Swedes have won the Nobel Prize than all of Asia.
At least in the early, actually, if you look at the first 3 decades of the Nobel Prize for Literature, you're actually amazed to see some of the names, because Some of them have just fallen off the map. Some were, from our current point of view, you probably see them as rather provincial writers. So why are they universal writers? I mean, those same decades, there would have been writers here in the subcontinent who were far more universal in their approach, in their reach, their impact even.
Yeah, definitely. The one author I would definitely want to talk about here is Selma Lagerlof. And the reason why I want to talk about her, who also won the Nobel Prize in Literature, I have not read the work that won her the Nobel, but what I find very interesting is that she had been commissioned by the Swedish government to write a geography textbook for children. And she actually wrote an adventure tale in which, as you go on the adventure, you discover the geography. It's called The Merry Adventures of Niels. So it's there at the Bakul library. So if any of you come down to the library when things get better, do check it out. That's a wonderful book for children. I thought, I wish we have textbooks like that, which in the form of fantastic stories tell you different things. In fact, I
didn't know that. Thank you. There's something I learned just now. So I'll make sure.
Yeah, I'll share the link with you. And in fact, I'll tell you, I did my geography because of my reading fiction. So I would sit down with a map to know where the characters are traveling. And that's how my geography improved. But anyway, let's see what other questions we have. I have one question though. This important point you made about knowing. Because I know that a lot of children who go to English medium schools end up, when they start writing about characters whose names are John, Janet, writing about dragons and fairies. And very often some of us are tempted to tell them, why don't you write about things that you know? So when you made this important point about knowing and not knowing, I was kind of reflecting on that question. So I would like you to talk about that.
I know what you mean. I think many of us have been through this predicament, but I wouldn't substitute one kind of fantasy with another. I mean, fine, you could be writing about Dave and Janet and Daphne, or you might be writing about Radha and Krishna, or whatever else you might want to regard. But I think this only traps us, particularly traps children, in a binaristic model, which they shouldn't have. I think children should actually be wide open to a variety of cultural possibilities. And I speak from my own experience. I was brought up in a highly, what I now recognize to have been a very multicultural way. So there was never a point where anybody said you need to choose this language or that. It was always this language and that and the other. So I actually grew up very multilingual. I mean, the family itself is multilingual. That's another story. But at no point did anyone say this is better than that and you need to know this language and not that. Likewise with the stories I heard the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, Buddhist parables, Andrew Lang, fairy tales from Europe, Peru, everything. There was the point, I think, and I think it's really important because the minds of children are so absorbent at that early point that the more you give them, I think the more it works. I'm troubled by what I take to be the well-meaning narrowness that seems to have fallen upon education. Sometimes by insisting on these cultural binaries, sometimes because everything is coming through the ultimately very flat screen of the smartphone, or indeed this device that you're sitting in front of. So what you're doing, as it happens, is absolutely amazing. A return to a form of reading that's haptic. Nothing can make up for the fact that you'll smell that vanilla that's escaping from paper and printer's ink. It's a sensuous haptic experience. It really extends what you're able to do as a reader in very physical and visceral ways. So my answer to this would be, allow children to be at home in a variety of cultural situations. Don't produce binaries that make them choose this or that. It can never be an either or. Sorry, there was a very long answer to a very precise question.
No. This is very interesting. The kind of, you said that, the important thing of being open and letting children, because sometimes we think, that is wrong. And I'll tell you one more thing that I, like about the physical book, particularly all our libraries, including the one that I'm sitting at, have been actually set up entirely through donated books.
Right.
So, and something I felt, even if we take to the digital medium, I mean, there was an oral culture, we moved to print culture, now we are moving to digital. But we all talk about literature teaching empathy. Also, the physical book, the culture of sharing, the fact that, I know that Ranjit's book has come to us. We have had volunteers catalog books, and a volunteer said, this book was gifted at a wedding in Kolkata 20 years back, which I had attended.
Wonderful.
So the books at our library seem to carry a story along with the one that is printed on the book. Now,
absolutely.
that's
So
not
beautiful.
something, when you send me a PDF of your book, I will not think that Ranjit has sent it to me.
I know.
It is a PDF, it is personal. But the book is your belonging, which now belongs to me. So
Absolutely.
a couple of questions will just end because I know you have another talk.
We can definitely take another question or two for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ranjan is asking about your opinion on the literary festivals, and Sudhanya Roy is asking about any Russian poet you can recommend. And we'll end with these two questions.
Okay, and then I'll answer the last one first. Current Russian poets, quite honestly, I am no longer in touch with what's currently going on in Russia. So for me, it's still a relatively classical and 20th century kind of understanding. So I cannot think of a current Russian poet, unfortunately. No, Valzhina Mort. I mean, she's of Belarusian ancestry and lives in the US and writes in both languages. She's a bilingual poet. So Valzhina Mort, I would definitely, not strictly Russian, but from within that.
The Soviet Union. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So I would definitely suggest her work. And how do I rate literary festivals in India? From my point of view, whether it's literature festivals or art biennials, the more the merrier. And each of them serves as a focus, as a platform where we remind ourselves why we became readers or writers in the first place. It brings us together with a sense of community. It creates a solidarity among all those who care for literature. Within that, of course, there'll be some festivals that are better organized, others that are less so, but these are matters of organizational detail. In no circumstances would I denounce the format itself. I think literature festivals are extremely important. But I think that they also should be, as in fact many of them are, part of a larger ecology of reading and writing. So this platform where we are, what Bakul is doing, for instance, is equally vital. And if people believe that there's some kind of glamour to literature festivals, then that would disappoint me a little. I don't think literature festivals are really about glamour, nor should they really be. There might be a glamorous aspect, but I think what is truly important is that they act exactly as you said, Sujit. They act as a place where we can share our enthusiasm for books, for writers, for traditions of writing, share our curiosity, and read together. The word colleague, as you know, comes from two Latin words that mean collegere, which mean to read together. So
that's
a colleague is one who reads together with you.
So, yeah,
and a college, a college is a collegium, a place where people read together.
Yeah.
So the act of reading is fundamental to many roles that we play. So for me, that's why festivals, lit fests, are so incredibly important, and we need to encourage them and sustain them as readers.
So I think for all the parents who are seeing this and all the children, I think it's so important for parents and children to be colleagues. I think that's
Indeed.
the best relationship.
Very important.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was wonderful listening to you. I'm sure everyone had a great time. I just want to remind all of you that we'll be back next Tuesday with another edition of Bakul Talks, the last one on the Nobel Prize in Medicine. But before that, as I have already informed you, the first session coming up this week is Thursday's book launch. Can we see the poster again? The book by Shubha Sharma, her second work of fiction, The Avasthis of Amnagiri. And we have a very distinguished panel of guests. There's Pratibha Ray, Gyanpith Awardee, a very eminent writer, Dr. Debashish Panigrahi, Tanaya Patnaik, and Shubha Sharma, the author herself. And this will be launched on this platform on the Bakul handles of Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter right at 8 p.m. on Thursday. And then, of course, on Saturday, we have story time at 9, where we'll be traveling to Canada with one of the finest storytellers from Canada at 9 p.m. And on Sunday, Rabibar Gopabar. So, Ranjit, you may be able to understand this. Rabibar Gopabar means Sunday is story day.
Sunday is wonderful. Yep. Yeah. Fantastic. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed this session, and I hope that our viewers and listeners did as well. And thank you so much for having me, Sujit. This was really wonderful.
Thank you so much, Ranjit, for being here. And I hope, as I said, I'm sorry, we would have loved to. Do we have time? Can you read out a poem of yours before we end?
Oh my God. I mean, I certainly have time, but I hope all of you do as well. I might just
let's end with a poem of yours. Let's end with a poem of yours.
Thank you. I'll do that. What shall I read? Okay, I'm going to read a... Okay, I'm going to read a poem called Lascar, which comes to us from the histories of the sea. And it's really about all those nameless crews of sailors and mariners who supported the age of discovery, as Europe likes to describe it. They came from our part of the world. They came from the Konkan, they came from Bihar, they came from the Malay Islands, they came from the Coromandel Coast, and their languages became part of the language we speak today as well. So this is called Lascar. Lascar, Bombay, Liverpool, London, 1889. And there's some reference to a Sherlock Holmes story, which some of you will catch. The Lascar was always sallow. It didn't help that his name anagrammed rascal. He carried a whiff of scurvy, a hint of rats in the hold, hulls battered by typhoons. He was never far from dirty work. Here's what the detective said. There's a trapdoor at the back of that opium den, near the wharf, which could tell strange tales of what passes through it on moonless nights. Here's what the good wife said. At the foot of the stairs, I met this Lascar who thrust me back and, aided by a Dane, pushed me out into the street. Meanwhile, her husband, only one man, knew my secret. He was the keeper of a low den in which I used to lodge, a Lascar, well paid by me for his rooms. My secret was safe with him. Neither detective, nor wife, nor husband knew the bleached village on the Konkan coast, or had seen the forced parades at tropical noon, the forts locked in rising silt, the standing crops burnt. History gave you one name. Fear gave you and your cousins others. To novelists, savage. To pamphleteers, cannibal. To scholars, anthropophage. To your captains, sea cunny, Tyndall, Sirang, Topaz, or mostly, as you swabbed the deck, cocoa-faced rascal. You call yourself names in the 3 tongues you speak in your sleep. Lashkar, Tarndale, Jahazi. They crowd us into the damp, shallow cradle they call the forecastle. Silly name. Furna, we call it. Furna, the hood, the wide fan-spread hood of this coiled sea cobra we're sailing. And that poem, to me, is something that speaks to the way in which immigrants who work for others have always sustained the great economies, whether it was the maritime economies of colonial empires or the economy of this country today. It's the people who we curse, we give them a bad name. We don't even know the names they call themselves, but we need to retrieve that. So this, for me, is a way of acknowledging and thinking about the migrants who work for us, who make us who we are, who sustain us, and who we so rarely acknowledge. That's a story about the 19th century ocean. We saw what happened in the last few months. We've seen how these people have had to walk home with no support at all. So let me end by simply keeping in mind the contributions, the often unsung contributions of the migrants who labor.
And not only that, I'd like to tell everyone I'm really happy he read out this poem, because when I was doing some reading on pandemics, after COVID happened, and the Lashkars were actually who are the lockers from Bangladesh and Eastern India.
Indeed. Yep.
And that was a generic name for Indian seamen and they were the ones blamed for the pandemics in the late 19th century in Europe. Exactly. So kind of, the way we looked at the Tabligis earlier in this year, yes, they were the ones. And actually, after reading your poem, I did a lot of research trying to see if the word rascal comes from Lashkar. And so does it come from that? I won't be surprised if it
is. It's just one of those strange happenstance.
I read someone writing that they have the provenance around the same time. But
is that
I
right?
wouldn't
My God. I'll have to look it up. I mean, I've always been struck by the anagram, but I should look it up.
I tried doing some research after reading your poem. And with my other research on language, I wouldn't be very surprised if that has happened. But yes,
I will look it up.
We will end here. Thank you very much, and look forward to having all of you in our subsequent sessions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. All the very best with everything. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye. Good night.
In education that we are trying to promote reading. As statistics say, if 50% children in grade 5 cannot read the textbook of grade 2, then what is really happening? That's because the basic skills of reading and writing is not there. So we thought that if we have to change this cynicism, then we need to demonstrate what is possible with small contributions. So that is the idea basically that Bakul is trying to demonstrate, what is possible entirely with volunteerism, entirely with small little contributions. We asked people to contribute books to set up a public library in Bhubaneswar, and a children's library was set up in Bhubaneswar, and now that children's library has become a general library, a public library with more than 20,000 books. So that is one of the major things. Another major area of intervention is environment, a lot of environmental education, but through films and through creative methods. So we have a traveling film festival on environment. We go to schools, colleges, apartments and screen films on environment, primarily on climate change and on issues of water and sanitation, two issues that we're working in. And at the libraries also, we conduct a lot of workshops on creativity. We all want the world to be a better place, and we have our own ideas of how it can be better. The thing is, can we all start in some small way towards addressing that? Can we say that in some small way, this world is the way I want it to be because I have done something about it?